Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another instalment of the MLA Productivity and Profitability webinar series. It's great to have you all on board tonight. My name is Erica Burnson, and I work for the webinar series coordinators aggregate. This series is designed to deliver on topics pertinent to sheep and cattle producers in relation to the productivity and profitability of their businesses. These webinars are recorded and can be accessed on MLA's website. The title of tonight's webinar is Lifting Lamb Survival and will be presented by our guest speaker, Nathan Scott, who is a consultant for Achieve Ag in Victoria. A bit of housekeeping before we get started. For those who aren't familiar with the webinar platform or need a refresh, the control panel you see to your right is able to be opened and closed using the red arrow so that you can enjoy the full screen view during the presentation. You should be able to hear us, but we can't hear you. So I encourage you to use the chat box in the control panel to communicate any questions you have during the presentation. Please make sure your questions are as succinct as possible so that they can be addressed with relevant responses. When you log out of the webinar, a survey will pop up for you to fill out. I would encourage you all to take the time to fill this out. The feedback we receive from this survey is important with the continuation of this webinar series, as it allows us to assess whether we are hitting the right topics for you, the audience. So let's kick off today's webinar. Tonight's presenter is Nathan Scott from Achieve Ag in Victoria. Nathan has a background in prime lamb, merino wool and beef production and a passion for improving the productivity and profitability of livestock enterprises. He works with producers to increase conception rates, improve lamb survival, lift growth rates and hone overall management. Nathan provides advice to individual clients, works with a large number of producer groups, is a keynote speaker and is involved within various industry projects. He is based in Inverleigh, Victoria. So welcome, Nathan, and thank you for joining me on our webinar tonight.
Thanks very much for having me.
I will just hand over tools to you and take it away.
All right, thank you very much. And apologies if there's a bit of background noise. The weather where I am right now in Victoria is horrendous, which is quite appropriate for the topic that we're talking about. So whenever I'm talking to any producer group or any of our clients, we always start off with the same philosophy. And that is that it doesn't really matter how good we are at what we do, whatever we do well today, we can do better tomorrow. And I think that's a philosophy that we can take into everything that we do in farming. We should always be looking for what we can do differently next year, because we know that if we just do the same things over and over again, we'll get the same results. And so we need to be looking for the things that we can do differently. And I suppose that's what I want to be able to take out of tonight for you, is what are some of the things that we can be looking for. Those of you that are lambing right now, what are the things that we can see this year that are going to help us influence next year? And for those of you that have already lambed, what can you look back on? And what can we reflect on to take into next year's lambing? Some of it will help you right now, but a lot of it will also be a flow on for what we can do for next year. And the first thing I just want to point out is this isn't a topic that's restricted to a certain group of our audience or a certain breed or anything else. When we think about who needs to improve lamb survival, the reality is it's everyone. And this comes on multiple fronts. It's not just a financial thing. It's not just that we're looking at amazing sheep prices and thinking we want to get hold of more of that. Some of it simply comes down to the moral obligation. If we are going to put fetuses on board, we need to keep lambs alive. And we need to be doing everything we can to get the best possible lamb survival. And so that's the basis for this, is that everyone actually needs to be trying to improve lamb survival, even those that are achieving really good results. And we've got some clients that are doing some amazing things that we would have thought 4, 5, 6 years ago weren't possible. And yet every year we're still looking for how much more can we do? What can we do to get that little bit more lamb survival out of them? And having said that, it's not just all about money. I do want you to think about it. I do want you to think about how much we're actually missing out on and what's it actually costing you each year. And this is just a couple of really quick, simple examples. So just back of the envelope type equations. The average flock in Australia is around about 1,500 ewes. So not very big, and a lot of you will be certainly lambing down a lot more ewes than that. But if we just use that as our example, if they're marking 98% lambs to ewes joined, is that a good result? The reality is we don't know. We don't know unless we know how many fetuses are on board. So if that flock was scanning at 140%, that's 2,100 fetuses, 630 lambs lost. And now you can put whatever figure you like on it, but we've just thrown $80 on each lamb. That is to assume that we don't get extra lambs for free. We've still got to grow them out, and that costs us money. So let's just assume we're getting an $80 net result out of each extra lamb we get. Across 1,500 ewes, that's $50,000 worth of lambs that we had on board that don't make it to the marking cradle. That's a 30% loss, or if you want to put into dollar terms, that's $33 per ewe per year that doesn't make it into the marking cradle. Now, next time we're thinking about whether we should be using a 20-cent drench or a 40-cent drench, or whether we should spend $1, we've got $33 per ewe in lambs that we're missing out on. Now, we're never going to get all of that, but we want to try and get hold of as much of that as we possibly can. If we take a high-performance flock and we look at that as an example, let's assume they're marking 130% lambs. A lot of people would say that's a great result, but we don't know unless we know how many fetuses we had on board in the first place, and we know what that wastage is. If they're scanning at 185%, that's 2,775 fetuses, or 825 lambs lost. At $80, that's $66,000 across 1,500 ewes. That equates to $44 per ewe. So it doesn't matter whether we're talking about a merino flock or a crossbred flock or a composite flock. There is a lot of money that's slipping through our fingers, and we aren't ever going to get all of it, but we want to get hold of as much of that as we possibly can. And that's what we want to focus on for tonight. And when we're looking at any biological system, there is always a limiting factor. And some of you will have seen this concept of Lieberg's law of the limiting factor. It's used a lot in soil sciences, which that's what this example is here. And the simplest way of describing Lieberg's law of the limiting factor is, if we're trying to fill up a barrel with water, there will always be a limiting factor that lets the water out. So in this first example, if moisture is our limiting factor or water is our limiting factor, that's where the water leaks out of the barrel. If we get a rain event and that takes the water up, something else becomes our limiting factor. Now, in sheep, it's exactly the same. We've always got a limiting factor. Now, most commonly, those limiting factors will be something like energy and protein. Sometimes it might be fibre, as in too much fibre or not enough fibre. And occasionally it might be a trace element or something along those lines. But the vast majority of the time, it will be energy and protein. The thing that I think as an industry we've really got to get our head around is that sometimes the most limiting factor in that whole equation is actually us. And I'll tease that out a bit more for you. But part of it is holding the mirror up and seeing that sometimes it's us that's the limiting factor, because we're the ones responsible for the energy and the protein. We're the ones responsible for looking after the livestock, making sure that they are getting everything that they need. And this is just to tease that out a bit further, is to look at specifically from a lamb survival point of view or a lamb loss point of view. This is from the Sentinel Flock Project, looking at the major causes of lamb mortality. And if we have a look at what those different categories are, starvation and mismothering makes up a very large proportion of that. And then we look at dystocia, which is a traumatic birth scenario. So that could be large lambs, or it could be maiden ewes, or a number of things that can influence that, and we'll talk about them a bit later on. Then we get into things like exposure. There's a group of lambs that we never know why they die. They're undiagnosed. Primary predation is a very small proportion in most cases. And then we get into things like abortions or premature births, infections, and misadventure is lambs stuck down a rabbit burrow, things like that. If we take a really critical look at what that breakdown actually looks like, it looks like this. And that is that our management can have an influence over a very large proportion of that lamb loss. Now, that's not to say that this is simple, and I don't want to oversimplify this whole message, but it does tell us that we can have an influence on some of these outcomes. And that's our job as livestock managers, is to do everything we can to reduce the impact of whatever those other factors might be. Now, as I sit here right at the moment, it's blowing an absolute gale and the rain's coming in sideways. That makes life difficult for us when it comes to lamb survival. So our aim is to control all of the things that we can control, all of the things that we can influence, and limit their impact, or limit the impact of the things that we can't control, such as the weather. Now, the first thing that we need to be able to do is we need to know who we're actually dealing with. Now, my answer is if you're not scanning for multiples, you can't possibly manage your sheep to give them the best possible opportunity for lamb survival. And this is why. We're dealing with at least 2, but potentially, depending on what type of flock you're running, 3 different animals. So let's just deal with 2, meaning singles and twins. Our biggest challenge is they look exactly the same. Unless you scan them and you know how many fetuses are on board, they look exactly the same. But that's not the reality. The reality is they are 2 vastly different animals. And we should be managing them as if they are 2 vastly different animals. The requirements of a single ewe versus a twin ewe are so different. And this is what they look like. So this is just an example I've grabbed from a client, from a graph we created for them. This is a 50 kilo ewe lambing in July. And you'll see that the yellow line is the single bearing ewe and the green line is a twin bearing ewe over the course of her reproductive period. And we end up with these 2 gaps opening up. So in late pregnancy, the requirements of a twin ewe is much higher than a single bearing ewe. And particularly once she drops those lambs and she's lactating and she's trying to feed those lambs, the gap in requirements is significant. They are 2 different animals. And so we need to manage them as 2 very different animals. And so I wanted to step through what those 2 different animals need in terms of what we provide for them, how we manage them. The first thing is to understand condition score. If you're not really confident at condition scoring, then I can't recommend highly enough that you go and get someone to show you. Go and do a lifetime ewe management course, or get someone who is good at condition scoring to spend the time with you. Make sure that you're really comfortable with condition scoring and estimating what that condition score of the animal is. And the reason for that is it has so many direct implications in the way your ewes are going to perform. So this one, I'm sure a lot of you will have seen these graphs plenty of times, but they are some of the best graphs we've ever had in the industry out of the Lifetime Wool Project. So this first one, we've got ewe condition score across the bottom, lamb birth weight up the side. There is a direct correlation between ewe condition score at lambing and the birth weight of her lambs. Now, the reason that's important for us is that there's a direct correlation between the birth weight of a lamb and its likelihood of survival. So basically, we've got a range that we're trying to achieve, which is between 4.5 kilos and 5.5 kilos. If we're under 4.5 kilos, the risk of exposure or death due to exposure, in other words, the weather, goes through the roof. And if we are above 5.5 kilos, and particularly above 6 kilos, the risk of dystocia goes through the roof. Now, to put this in really simple terms, the reason this happens is we're looking at surface area to volume ratios. Basically, if we look at a lamb that's under 4.5 kilos and we look at its surface area to volume ratio, it's like if we had a fire, if you've got your fire going inside, we bring in a piece of paper and a house brick and we warm the 2 of them up in front of the fire. And then we take them out into the cold night air. The piece of paper will cool down straight away because it has this really big surface area and not enough volume to retain the heat. On the flip side, the house brick, which has this great amount of volume, retains its heat for longer. So what we're looking for is less pieces of paper, which are those lambs under 4.5 kilos, and more house bricks, which are those lambs that sit between 4.5 and 5.5 kilos. And what we don't want is the block of flats, which are those lambs that are above 5.5 kilos, those particularly 6 kilo plus lambs, because that's where we start to run into things like dystocia, so traumatic births. And the best example I can give you of that, of a traumatic birth or a lamb that suffered from dystocia, they're not always the lamb that we have to pull. Sometimes they're a lamb that is born, the mum manages to get that lamb out, but it's been a delayed process and that lamb suffers from a small bleed on the brain in the process. The pressure, the time in the birth canal causes a small bleed on the brain. And the best example I can give you is a pet lamb. So often a pet lamb is a lamb that someone finds, it's a big healthy lamb, really big to some degree, and you take it home and you try and feed it, and it takes a fair bit of effort to get it to feed, and then it's weird for the rest of its life. And the reason is because it has a small amount of brain damage. And a ewe isn't going to waste time on an animal that she knows isn't right. If she can't get it to feed, she can't get it up and get it going, then she won't waste time on it. And so often they're the lambs that we find wandering around the paddock and become a pet lamb. So one of the simple things that you can do, and you can do this right now if you're lambing, is start weighing lambs that you come in contact with. So that means I don't want you out there running around picking up every lamb you can in the paddock, but what I do want you to do is, if you have to pull a lamb, weigh it. If you find a dead lamb, if you're driving along and you find a dead lamb, pick it up and weigh it. It can tell you so much of what's going on in your paddock. If it's under 4.5 kilos, there's a very good chance that it's died due to exposure. If it's over 5.5 kilos, there's a very good chance that it's suffered some form of dystocia, even just a small bleed on the brain, and that's causing you a problem. And if you've got a whole lot of them that are falling inside the ideal range, between 4.5 and 5.5 kilos, then we want to know more. It could just be mismothering, so we've got too much disturbance happening in paddocks, and we'll talk about that a bit more. Or it could be that you've got some sort of health issue that's contributing to the problems along the way. Just to touch on this one quickly, I'm sure you've all seen this in your paddocks, but the yellow staining on lambs. I'm always amazed at how many producers have never had it explained to them what that actually is, why we're seeing golden lambs. But that is the meconium staining. So the meconium is the first poo of the lamb, and a lamb that goes into stress during the birthing process will pass that meconium, and that's what causes it to get stained bright yellow. So this example here that you see is a ewe lamb having twins. The first lamb's come through okay. You can see a little bit of meconium staining on it. The second lamb had gone into fetal stress. So this is exactly the same as what happens in humans. If the doctors see meconium, they immediately get that baby out, whether that's through a cesarean or through some other intervention. But they know that the baby has gone into fetal stress. And the same thing happens in lambs. So in this case, it could just be that she's a maiden ewe, and so she's had a delayed birth. It can also be birth weight related, so big lambs. It could even be a subclinical calcium issue where the lamb, or the ewe, sorry, is having a delayed process because her muscle function isn't as good as it should be. But it's certainly something that if you're seeing a lot of yellow lambs in your paddocks, it's worth investigating just to see what's going on. There is some sort of stress happening during that birthing process. So if we put it all together, there is a direct correlation between ewe condition score at lambing and lamb survival. Now, you'll see that the single-born lambs aren't terribly affected by it because single lambs do a great job of surviving. It's the twin-born lambs that are the most affected. And so getting the condition score of our twin ewes right is absolutely critical in terms of keeping that survival as high as we possibly can. It's also, ewe condition score is clearly also really important when it comes to ewe mortality. Now, this won't be a great surprise to any of you, but a ewe that's condition score 2 or less has a dramatic increase in mortality rate. I think the thing that should be a surprise to everyone is just how high that can get if we're down at condition score 1.5 or lower. And that's something we desperately have to avoid as an industry. So in terms of what we can do, if we've got the ewe in the right condition score, we then start thinking about how we actually set up for lambing. And the 5 Ps that come out of the Lifting Lamb Survival Program are exactly what we want to focus on. And I'm going to step you through each of them as we go. So first off, it's pastures. Now this one's an obvious one, but we need to try and get the feed on offer right at lambing. And this is for multiple reasons. The obvious one is the ewe condition and milk production, but the less obvious one is we're trying to get that ewe to stay on her birth site for as long as we possibly can. And that needs to be no less than 6 hours for that ewe and lamb to properly bond and develop that maternal bond. So if we've got a ewe in good condition score, she's not desperate for a feed, but when she does look for one, we want her to find it at her feet and not have to travel the paddock. For every metre she moves off that birth site, it will increase the risk of that lamb not making it through. And so we can set some basic targets. For our single bearing ewes, we want 1,000 to 1,200 kilos or a bit better, but not too much. We've got to make sure that we're not putting too much feed in front of those single ewes, because that can create some birth weight issues, particularly those that are joined on the second cycle. So often someone will be down at the pub saying they haven't pulled a lamb at week 3, and then beyond that point they spend their time pulling lambs. And that's the reality of ewes that go into good lambing paddocks, single bearing ewes going into good feed and putting all of that feed into their growing lamb in utero for that first 3 weeks before she drops her own lamb. And then that's where some of the pulling of lambs comes from. And then for twin bearing ewes, it's 1,400 kilos plus. It's trying to make sure that we give her every opportunity to meet her nutritional needs through that late pregnancy and early lactation period. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because it requires more time than we've got tonight, but it is possible for you to actually work out how many kilos of dry matter a ewe is going to eat in your lambing paddocks. And the Lifting Lamb Survival Program actually steps you through this process of calculating how many kilos a ewe's going to eat each day on average roughly, and therefore what your stocking rate can be for a paddock based on your pasture growth rate at that time of year. So it's not a guessing game. We don't need to just guess that maybe there should be 5 ewes to the hectare in that paddock or 6 ewes to the hectare. We can actually calculate it, work it out based on how that goes this year. We can adjust it for next year. There is a process there that we can follow and take some of the stress away from setting up your lambing paddocks each year. The one thing on protection that I'll just quickly touch on is it's hard to produce shelter for everything. What we're trying to do is avoid that scene on the left-hand side. What we're trying to do is create as much as we can of that picture on the right-hand side, but we know that's damn hard to do. And so just having the thought process of making sure that your most vulnerable sheep, which are generally your lightest condition score twin bearing ewes, in the best sheltered paddocks. And shelter comes in many forms. It doesn't have to be trees. It can be rocks. It can be just simply aspect of a paddock. So it might be a northeast facing paddock rather than a southwest facing paddock. All of those things should come into consideration as you're doing it. And then what I think is probably the most underestimated and yet the most important in terms of what you're doing right now, if you're lambing right now, it's giving the ewe as much privacy as we possibly can. And that's on a number of different fronts. I said before, we want a minimum of 6 hours uninterrupted on the birth site. And the challenge for that is threefold, really. It's us checking ewes and the potential for disturbance there. If it's a tight season and you're having to feed ewes, then that absolutely creates some disturbance and moves ewes off their birth site. And then the third one is mob size, which I'll touch on. But first, on the checking of ewes, this is something that's certainly changed across our clients over the last few years, and that is to limit as much as possible how much we have to go into a lambing paddock. Now, I can't possibly justify a ewe dying because she's cast or because she's got a lamb stuck. So we have to be able to see any of those problems. But we're doing so much more now with binoculars from a distance. It's planning the lambing paddock run to make sure that we only go where we have to go to be able to see the whole area. And if we can't see a problem, we don't go any further. If we can see a problem, then you work out the risk of going in there at that time, or should I come back a little bit later in the day when the other ewes have settled and we haven't got as many fresh lambs on the ground, those sorts of things. It's the hardest one by far for our clients to change, because it's one of those human natures. We want to drive around everything all the time. It's just about becoming a bit more strategic about it and not spending too much time in those lambing paddocks. In terms of mob size, and this is a privacy issue, it's about trying to reduce the amount of confusion that happens in the paddock. And this really comes down to how many lambs are born on any given day. And we're trying to reduce that as much as we possibly can. So for twins, You might think this is ridiculous, but the ideal twin mob size that everyone always asks me, my answer is 1. Anything bigger is a compromise. And that's the reality. So we've got to find the practicality in mob size, but ultimately we're trying to keep them as small as we possibly can for twins and particularly for triplets. But in all reality, less than 100 in merinos, definitely less than 150 in crossbreds and composites. Most of our clients, we're aiming to try and get those twin mobs down to around 70 or 80. We think that's a fairly practical midpoint, and I'll talk about how we're doing it in a minute. It's not easy, but it's also it's not too difficult either. Singles, who cares, is a little bit it's not quite how I look at it, but I'm quite happy because a single bearing ewe drops a lamb, turns around and cleans it, and has no opportunity for any other ewes to come onto that birth site and start interfering. So a single ewe is quite safe in terms of that lamb survival. So look, we've put some numbers there of 250 and 300, but the reality is for singles, I'm happy for them to be as big as they need to be. It's more based on a stocking rate basis than an actual mob size basis. The only rider I'd have on that is I still like maiden mobs, even singles, to be as small as we can practically achieve. Now, obviously, there'll be some of you that are dealing with extremely large paddocks and some of the complexity of this becoming practical, but it's still the same. It doesn't matter whether we're dealing with huge paddocks, big mobs. The requirements to try and keep more lambs alive are exactly the same. It's just the practical application that we've got to adjust to try and make it work in your scenario. And this is how the majority of our clients are actually doing it. Temporary electric fencing. Now, if you had have asked me 4 or 5, 6 years ago, did I think most of my clients would be using electric fencing with sheep, temporary electric fencing with sheep, I would have said not on your life. But here we are. And it's changed entirely the results that we can achieve, and it's changed entirely the way we go about setting up lambing paddocks. So if we've got a 30 or a 40 or a 50 hectare paddock, that doesn't have to have an influence on our mob size. We can just run a couple of hot wires across and we can drop mob size significantly across the whole farm. And I'll just share one quick example because it's a bloody good one. Nathan Hahn at Mondillaby, a client of ours, about 15,000 ewes each year joined. They had 6,500 twin bearing ewes last year with an average mob size of 70. This year's pretty similar. 3,000 ewe lambs, again, because our maidens, we're trying to drop even the singles in terms of mob size. The average mob size across those was 70 as well, and triplets was down to 27. And it's all done with hot wires because we just can't justify splitting a farm up with permanent fencing on that front down to that level, and we don't want that for the rest of the year. We still need the practicality of decent paddock sizes. But at this time of year, and when we've got lambs hitting the ground, we're just trying to limit that movement across the paddock and limit the number of birth sites that a ewe has access to. Because a ewe, just before she goes into her own labour, will go looking for the smell of afterbirth, and she will visit every single birth site she can find in the paddock. And that's what creates the confusion and can cause otherwise very healthy lambs to become mismothered and die. So if you want more information on that front, there is, I've been lucky enough to be involved in a project with AWI developing videos for the Changemaker series. There is one specifically on lambing mob size that's worth having a look at if you want more info. The next that's really important is for you to actually know what your paddocks have done previously. So what the past performance of a paddock is. Keeping records this year so you know how a paddock performed for next year when you're setting up is really important. It can tell you so much. And that might just be paying attention to how a mob behaves in an individual paddock. If they're hanging down one end the whole time and they're not using the whole paddock, what can we do to influence it next year? Or should it be singles in there and not twins? The last one, because this one comes up a lot. Now, if you've got dogs, wild dogs, then clearly you will have predator problems. But for the vast majority of us, the primary predation, as in the lambs that weren't otherwise going to die but have been killed by a fox, for instance, those numbers are actually much lower than any of us would have otherwise believed. Often a fox is killing what was already going to die. They're not silly. They want a hot meal, but they want an easy meal. The one rider on that is when you get one of these buggers, and that's a sport killer. Something that is out there for fun. and you will see that simply out of the fact that they will only chew out the tongue. They're not actually eating the lamb. And I suppose the evidence is you will have seen foxes walk through mobs of ewes and the ewes barely react to it. So it's only when we get one of those sport killers that we really have a problem. I'll just finish with saying this as a simple wind up. How many lambings do you have left in you? The reality is most of us don't have that many. We don't have 30 or 40 or 50 of them. We might have 10 or 20 of them. So how many things can we change to try and get right now? If you haven't already done it, check out the Lifetime Ewe Management course or Lifting Lamb Survival. If you've already done Lifetime Ewe Management, hone your skills, keep looking for the ways that you can do things differently next year. I've got one last quick example, and this is a client of ours, Gordon Brown. Over the last few years, he's achieved some absolutely amazing lamb survival and some amazing lamb marking results. That's lambs marked to ewes joined in his mature ewes. But to me, that's not the exciting part. The exciting part is the fact that every year he says, yep, it's a great result. It's the best we've ever achieved. But there are a few things that I want to do differently next year. There's a few things that we can do better next year. He never rests on his laurels. He's always looking for that next thing that we can do to achieve a better result. And that brings us back to where we started. It doesn't matter how good we are on a lamb survival front. Whatever we do well today, we can do better tomorrow. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Nathan. That was really good, and thank you for giving us some insight into management decisions affecting lamb survival and the knock-on, basically, cost effect or loss of production in losing those lambs. Just before we get into some questions, I'm aware that some of you may have to take off early. I'll just ask that you please fill out the survey as you exit the webinar. This survey is shared with MLA and the presenters to help improve extension efforts and make sure that we are targeting topics relative to you. Please tune in for next week's webinar as well. So let's kick off with some questions. I've had one in saying that someone has had some experience with assisting ewes giving birth only to find that the ewe has no colostrum or initial milk. Do you have any idea what the problem may be?
So without, and I preface this with I'm not a vet, but the vast majority of those situations will be a premature birth where she's actually gone into labour early. Now that could be for a multitude of reasons. It could be an infection or an issue such as Campylobacter or toxoplasmosis or listeria, which can be very late pregnancy. So while it's an abortion, they can be a fully formed lamb. It can also be under nutritional stress. She'll drop a lamb early, which is a preservation mechanism for herself, but she may not have fully developed the colostrum and be ready to feed a lamb at that point. So there's a multitude of things that it could be. None of them are good, and so it's worth investigating further.
Yep, so you'd sort of maybe get hold of your local vet for that.
Yes, get some advice.
Yep. All right, thank you very much. Laura would like to hear more about the practical side of setting up electrical fences, the time it costs to put them up, cost of gear, etc. Do you have any ballpark figures that you might be able to share? Yeah,
so the vast majority of our clients are actually using the cheapest possible poly wire that they can use. So a lot of that, there's a multitude of stores that sell it or online. You can find stacks of it on eBay. It's surprisingly good in terms of carrying power. We've had up to 12,000 volts running through them, so no issues in terms of carrying the power, and it's better than the tape. Most people's experience historically with electric fencing is with poly tape, and it's rubbish. It flaps in the breeze and causes your fences to start to fall over, all those sorts of things. So the poly wire is the best option. It's extremely cheap, and then it's poly tread-ins that most people are using as well, the plastic tread-ins. So again, the cheapest sort of version they can. The reality for the electric fencing is that it only actually needs to be up for about, say, 3 to 4 weeks in your lambing paddocks, just until you get the majority of lambs on the ground. So it's not out in the sun, it's not been exposed from a UV point of view, so that's why I suggest that we don't have to go for the top of the range stuff. In terms of cost, it's very cheap. It depends how you costed out over a period of time. So whether you think it's going to last 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, that sort of thing. But there is a return on investment that's quite significant. So at the very minimum, it would be a 3-to-1 return on your investment that we're seeing, but it's generally considerably higher than that, depending on the survival result at the start versus what we were able to achieve with that splitting up of mobs.
Yeah, so the cost of the fencing will basically pay for itself in more lambs produced, in theory.
Yes, absolutely, and very quickly.
Yeah, brilliant. Staying on the line of splitting up paddocks, a few people are a bit concerned about how you deal with watering points, and how important they are, as in how much water will each ewe need if you've got your mobs.
So very, very good question, and I should have actually pointed that out as we went through. So it depends on your situation, and even from a seasonal point of view, as to how much water you're going to require. So the reality for a lot of people, so depending on where you are in the country and what your season looks like, if you've hit your feed on offer targets, so particularly because we're talking twin mobs, so we've got 1,500 kilos or thereabouts, those ewes are actually eating in the order of 30 kilos of water a day, or 30 litres of water a day. So, which is much, much greater than the amount of water they would ever normally need to drink in a day. So their water intake at that time of year is extremely low, if at all. So for the vast majority of our clients, they will put something in the paddock so that they know that they've got water availability as they go back at the end of the test. So I'm not going to suggest to people that they don't need water. I'd still like water to be available to sheep. But when we've got enough green feed on offer, it's not a problem for us. As that drops off, though, if you get caught in a tight season, absolutely you have to have water there. If their intake of green feed is restricted, they will need another water source. So you need to find a way to do it.
Yep. Okay, thank you. We've got a few more questions coming in. Oh, it's moved. Sorry. Someone was asking about the actual size of these different lambing paddocks. Is there a specific area that should be set out for each ewe, if you like? So, yeah.
So this is the interesting part of this whole process of splitting up for lambing, is that it's not density, it's simply mob size. So we won't see a difference between, say, 10 ewes to the hectare versus 5 ewes to the hectare. But you will see a difference between 150 ewes in a mob versus 70 ewes in a mob. So what we're actually managing to do with this electric fencing is keep stocking rate right up on our best paddocks, but reduce mob size at the same time by splitting those best paddocks up with hot wires. So it's not about a particular size of paddock. That simply comes down to what stocking rate that pasture will carry, as in how many ewes per hectare can we carry on that pasture. Otherwise, it's just about getting mob size as low as we can.
Yeah. Thank you. Nick has said he's found that composite ewes don't have much respect for electric fences. So should you introduce them earlier to this style of fencing, and how much earlier should it be introduced to them?
Yeah, it's a good point. So there's two different ways of approaching this. The one is, I have absolutely no doubt that at weaning is the time for us to train all sheep. So any sheep that are going to stay on your farm, weaning is the time to train them well onto really good fences, and ideally really good fences that have got a bit of power in them. So that's one way to set them up for their future. In terms of introducing the electric fencing, the closer you get to lambing, the less likely they are to jump. Because we're talking twin and triplet ewes here. They're the ones that we're splitting with hot wires. They become heavy in lamb. They're not jumping. They're not taking on hot wires. So the further out from lambing you set those electric fences up, the more trouble you will have with them going through them. But as we get closer to the point of lambing and they're heavily in lamb, they're not interested in jumping, particularly if the feed is exactly the same on either side of the hot wire, and particularly if you've got plenty of power in that fence to begin with, to make sure the first time their nose goes near it, they decide it's a bad idea.
All right, that's very handy information to know. John has said, have you got any examples of selection? I'm guessing that's genetic selection for improved lamb survival.
So if you want to directly select for lamb survival, then number of lambs weaned as an ASBV is where you need to look. There are some other factors that will have an influence as well. So certainly across our client base, there's a focus on fat and muscle and growth. That's whether we're talking merinos, composites, crossbreds, they've got the same sort of focus. But if you want direct selection for extra survival, it's number of lambs weaned as an ASBV, or Australian sheep breeding value.
Yeah. Okay. Lachlan, has just started out farming Dorper sheep. He's purchased scanned-in lamb ewes, and he's wondering where is a good starting point to collect data in relation to lambing rates.
First of all, so absolute number one for me is to know what your potential is. So that's scanning. You have to know that scanning result. So if he's purchased scanned-in lamb, then hopefully he's got that information already. And then beyond that, it's actually working out what that turns into. What potential are you capturing in actual lamb's mark? So without a doubt, understanding your survival rates is the first starting point. And then beyond there, it's actually knowing what sort of growth rates we're getting out of lambs and tracing your way that way. But first and foremost, make sure each year you know how many fetuses we've got on board and what our lambs marked are. So what's our wastage? How much of that potential are we actually capturing?
Okay, sorry, there's an awful lot of questions coming through. I'm just trying to sort through them. Lewis says, what's your thoughts on inspecting lambing mobs with drones to avoid disturbance? And also he'd like to know if lick supplements such as magnesium and calcium are commonly used. Is this best practice?
Okay, starting with the drones first of all. About 8 years ago, I thought this was going to be fantastic, and I rushed out to the market and bought myself a drone. And I asked for permission from a client to fly it over some lambing ewes and to test it out. And the ewes ran in every direction. And I quickly flew it back, put it in the car, and drove home. The answer on drones is you need quite a good one. So we have a couple of clients that have started using them and very effectively. The difference is 8 years ago, the drone that I bought was rubbish compared to what we can get now. So that is, you need to be able to fly them at a decent height because the noise is like nothing sheep have ever seen or heard before. And we need a decent camera so you can zoom right in to be able to look from a decent height. You can get ewes more accustomed to it by flying them over them in the lead up to lambing, but still ultimately it comes down to more expensive drones tend to be quieter, and you just tend to be able to fly at a higher altitude and using a good camera still be able to see everything you need to be able to see. So yes, we are seeing more and more drone usage, and they are proving to be very, very good. In terms of licks, yes, there are a large range of licks used. The vast majority of what people are trying to achieve is calcium and magnesium and sodium supplementation in that process. It is by far the most complex topic, and there is no single solution for people. So calcium is a minefield, and it's one that needs a lot more time than I can dedicate to it right now.
That's okay, thank you. Ian would like to know how many large-scale producers scan for triplets and how do they manage them?
We're absolutely seeing more and more scan for triplets because particularly if you're scanning at, say, 170% without counting triplets, you'd be looking at anywhere from probably 7 to 18% of your total ewes in lamb being triplet-bearing ewes. So it's becoming more and more obvious that we need to know who they are. We also see a higher rate of mortality in triplets. So we need to do everything we can to manage those ewes and to understand what it is that's helping avoid that mortality and trying to improve lamb survival. So in terms of management, it's managing them from scanning separately to try and get as much nutrition into them as we can, manage their body condition scores so that we're not ending up with excessively fat ewes and sore feet. And then in terms of lambing, it's mob sizes as small as we can possibly achieve, and trying to get that nutrition right around lambing. And I can't give you a clear answer on that one yet. There's a national triplet project that's being undertaken at the moment that will produce more answers and better recommendations for us all. in terms of that absolute best scenario in terms of nutrition at lambing.
Okay, thank you, John. Hopefully that'll answer your question about triplets as well. If you'd like more information, please just put it in the chat. Joe would like to know, what survival percentage does Gordon get for singles, twins, and triplets?
Okay, so I'm sure he won't mind me sharing this. It's over 90% in his singles. His twins tend to be in that low 90% as well. Triplets are still by far the biggest challenge for everyone. So our target is 70% of fetuses or better, and that is not easy to achieve. So we have seen it in mobs better than that, and that's not just Gordon's example, but across a few of our other clients. It's the most difficult, and sometimes that's on the basis of the fact that ewe mortality becomes a problem that immediately drags your percentage down. Obviously, if we don't have a ewe alive, there's 3 lambs missing as well, and often that's because the triplet-bearing ewe might be older, and also therefore potentially more compromised from a calcium point of view.
Yep. Okay, thank you. We've got a few questions now regarding supplementary feed. Never says, I hope I pronounced that correctly, our food on offer is limited in the lambing paddocks this year. What's the best supplement feed? And their first lamb dropped today.
It's a real challenge. When we're struggling for feed at the point of lambing, it is a real challenge because there is no easy answer for you. So each option has pros and cons. Silage fed can give you quite good silage can give you quite good nutrition and the opportunity for sheep to come and go from it without having to rush to it. Grain feeding can be a problem because we tend to have sheep rush to grain, and that moves them off their birth site. So if we're trail feeding, that can be a problem of trail feeding. The alternative is you use lick feeders with grain in them, and they can also have their downside because we can't control intake, or there's the propensity for shy feeders. You actually need quite a lot of feeders to be able to get through decent levels of intake from them. It's a real challenge when we can't put the paddock feed in front of ewes. So a few years ago, we had clients use really high quality hay. They were caught in a position where they just didn't have the feed in front of ewes for lambing. They used vetch hay. They just dropped bales throughout every paddock and just made sure that the sheep never ran out. And it actually worked incredibly well. There is wastage that comes with that because sheep eating from bales left in a paddock don't do a terribly good job of it. The one little trick that we've learned over time is that if we're using big square bales, you leave the bottom 2 strings on, not the top 2. We used to always leave the top 2 strings on to try and keep the bale together, but they still pull all of the hay out and stand on it from the bottom. So if you leave the bottom 2 strings on, they eat from the top, or bottom 2 or 3 strings, they eat from the top, and they don't have the ability to drag as much down and stand on it and waste it. So that's the best option I've managed to find so far, but none of them are real great options, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Neil would like to know, what sources of fibre do you recommend? Bales of straw or better quality like oaten hay, vetch, or other?
It depends absolutely on the scenario. So if we are just chasing fibre, my question would be why we're chasing fibre. Most of our pastures actually have at least sufficient, if not too much, fibre in them as they stand. So the true example of where we don't have enough fibre is in a fodder crop situation, which is clearly not necessarily to do with lambing, but a brassica is too low in fibre. If you look at the rest of our pasture species, clover at 32% fibre is exactly where we want it. Most of your phalaris and ryegrass will be above 40% fibre, which is actually higher than what is ideal for an animal. So often we are providing fibre which only, so it'll stop dag, it'll slow down the amount that's squirting out the back end of an animal. It'll actually reduce production though. It's one of those things that the ewe is eating so much water, it can only come out of the body in a couple of different ways, and one of those is out the back end. So if you see squirting, sometimes that means it's working. And if we go and stick fibre into that situation, you'll actually reduce her ability to eat enough megajoules of energy in a day.
Okay.
So that one needs a bit more discussion to understand the specific scenario.
Yeah, no, that's okay. Norman would like to know, or would like you to explain, sorry, further why it is mob size and not sheep density that has the greatest impact on lamb survival.
Okay, so this comes down to again, just it's the number of birth sites that are available to a ewe on any given day. So a ewe, when she goes into labour, just prior to her active labour, when she actually starts trying to push the lamb out, her hormones kick in and she starts looking for the smell of afterbirth. And so she will travel the paddock looking for that smell of afterbirth. Now, in a single bearing ewe, it works fine because she drops her lamb and she turns around and she cleans it. And no one else really gets an opportunity to interfere. But in a twin bearing paddock, it's the time between the first and the second lamb, or the second and third lamb if we're talking triplets, where other ewes in the paddock who have just gone into labour looking for the smell of afterbirth will come onto the birth site of another ewe and they'll start trying to clean lambs that aren't theirs. And that's what creates the confusion. And so the problem there is, as soon as she goes into her true labour and she starts trying to push, that lamb that she tried to clean of someone else's, she's no longer interested in. And no one's interested in that lamb. That can be a perfectly healthy lamb that then wanders off and you'll find it sitting against a tree dead or under a feeder or somewhere. They'll go and find shelter somewhere. They've just got no one feeding them. So that's why it's about mob size. It's just reducing the ability to go and muck around on someone else's birth site, essentially. So that's why it doesn't matter how many ewes to the hectare there are. It just matters how many ewes are lambing on that day. So one of the things I should have mentioned is if you're scanning for early and late, for instance, there'll be a few in the industry that are doing that. It makes mob size even more important. If we're splitting down to a single cycle of joining, so therefore all of the ewes in that group are going to lamb inside a 17-day period, your mob size becomes even more critical because you've got even more ewes that are lambing on any given day.
Okay, thank you. John would like to know if we have an issue that so much data seems to be based on merinos, who has a 55 kilo crossbred ewes at fat score 4 or average crossbred lamb weight of 4.5 kilos. Both examples seem to be very low compared to reality for crossbred or composite ewes. I hope I've made sense of that question.
I can understand what he's saying. So yes, a whole lot of those graphs that I show are from the Lifetime Wool Project, which is merino based. There's been some maternals work done, which has improved that in terms of how that looks for crossbreds and composites. The concepts are still exactly the same. In terms of birth weight, we're still looking at that same window. In a crossbred or composite, you may still have a little bit more room to move at the top end. So in other words, a 5.5 kilo lamb might be born without too much issue. Once we get to 6 kilos, you're still going to face the same problem. So while, yes, the work was done on merinos, the concepts are still the same. We're still looking at differences in energy requirements between singles and twins. It's just that those total requirements are higher in a crossbred than they are in a merino. And similarly, in terms of birth weight, the window is actually still very similar in terms of kilos. It's just actually easier to achieve the higher birth weights in crossbreds and composites than it is in merinos. Concepts are still all the same. It's just that they do creep up slightly on that graph.
Okay, thank you. Mel would like to know. Sorry, my screen moved. Mel would like to know what type of twinning rate to singletons ratio at scanning enables the high 168% overall lambing percentage.
Extremely high. So his total percentage of singles would be 15% or less. So of those ewes pregnant, less than 15% of them would be singles, and the rest are twins and triplets. They're big scanning percentages. So there are composite and crossbred flocks that are routinely scanning. When they start counting the third lamb, so actually looking for triplets and including that in the scanning percentage, there are plenty of flocks around now that are scanning in the high 190s, low 200s. And that's simply a genetics and nutrition thing. There's no Barula gene. There's no other interference with Ovistim or any of those things. It's simply condition score, nutrition, and genetics.
Wow, so that really does set an example to us all.
Yeah, the one thing I would say is scanning percentage is absolutely useless unless you get survival out of them. So there's no point in chasing big scanning percentages unless we can convert them into live lambs.
Yeah.
To a degree, that's just irresponsible.
And going from that thought, what is the target for percentage of fetuses marked across all ewes?
That depends heavily on what your starting point is. So ideally, we are chasing in the mid to high 80s, but again, it depends on your twin to single ratio. So you need to work that out for an individual. So in, say, a merino flock that doesn't have a lot of twins, we can actually achieve a really high overall survival percentage because we keep a lot of singles alive. If you are scanning in higher percentages in crossbreds and composites, where we've got a bigger proportion of twins and triplets, then that can skew that overall or the total percentage of fetuses. So that sounds like I'm fence sitting, but we do need to actually work that out for the individual based on what your makeup of your ewes is in terms of twins, singles, and triplets.
Okay, that's interesting. James said, you touched on second cycle singles. Should I be scanning for early and late and managing accordingly too? Are there many people doing this, and how does it work?
I think it's a fantastic tool. One, you need to talk to your scanner because not all scanners are comfortable and confident doing it because it's not simple, it's not straightforward. If your scanner is comfortable and confident in doing it, it can be an extremely valuable tool. It comes with the rider that, as I've said, for your twins and your triplets, it potentially makes it even more difficult and you need to get your mob size even smaller. But certainly for those second cycle singles, managing them separately can pay big dividends. One, it means you've got some paddocks that you don't need straight away at the start of lambing. You might have an extra week or two before you have to go into those lambing paddocks, which can be really valuable because there's always a couple of paddocks that aren't quite ready when you want them to be. But it can also just mean that you avoid that extra 2 weeks of them putting a heap of quality feed in and blowing those lamb birth weights out. So it can be a very, very useful tool. And the other thing that I think probably is underestimated is we don't have to use that data every year. Just because you scan for for early and late in a year doesn't mean we need to split everything into early and late. You might decide, because of the way the season is, we're not splitting the twins into early and late, but we are going to use that information on the singles. We do just want to keep those second cycle singles separate. So just because you scan for early and late doesn't mean you have to use it across every mob every time.
Okay, thank you. I know that I've had a bit of experience with if people were AIing and then they put their cover rams out, they'd scan for the AI, or if they were pregnant to the cover rams as well. So that can be a useful tool in determining, who the sires are as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Luke would like to know, would it be more based on a percentage of mature ewe weight for lamb weight for survival?
Sorry, just run that one past me again.
Would it be more based on a percentage of mature ewe weight for lamb weight for survival?
So, no, not necessarily. So I think, if I'm understanding what he's meaning, if we've got heavier ewes, do we need heavier lambs for survival? I hope I'm interpreting that right. It still comes back to that 4.5 to 5.5 kilo range as being a really critical tipping point for us. So no matter what size your mature ewes are, so whether you've got a 50 kilo merino or say an 85, 90 kilo composite, which unfortunately we know there's quite a few of them around the countryside, it doesn't matter. It still comes down to surface area to volume ratio in those lambs. So it's still that same window. 4.5, 5.5 kilo lambs stay alive.
Okay, thank you. John has mentioned that Nathan Han, the Nathan Han example seemed to have very little protection, yet mob size is excellent, but there is a linear relationship as exposure is very significant killer of lambs.
Yeah, so that one particular photo was a paddock that didn't have a lot of protection. They do have some good protection across the farm, and they do prioritise to the different groups of animals. So, but there is across all of our clients, our aim is to make sure we use aspect as well as we can. Use shelter that we've got, as in physical shelter, trees, rocks, those sorts of things. But an absolute priority is feed, condition score, and birth weight of those lambs. So if we've got better birth weights, if we've got them in the ideal range, and we've managed our ewes successfully, the impact of weather is greatly reduced. Clearly, any at-risk animals need prioritisation for the best sheltered paddocks though. So it's always a combination of trying to get everything right and as many of those things that we can control right as we can so that the weather has a less of an impact. Clearly that depends on your location as well, because some areas will cop bad weather occasionally, other areas will cop bad weather all the way through. So we've got a couple of clients that are in that scenario and still achieving good results despite them. One of them had 300 millimetres of rain during the 5 weeks of lambing a couple of years ago and still achieved his lamb survival results.
Wow, that's awesome. Lewis would like to know if there's any risk in having cows calving and ewes lambing in the same paddock.
Very good question. Mature cows don't seem to be a problem. Heifers are a problem. Heifers will play with anything that looks fun to play with, which includes newborn lambs. So yeah, my experience is mature cows are okay, particularly if there's only a handful of them in each paddock, and we certainly can use that to try and keep the total DSEs up in a paddock, stocking rate up, but keep mob size down. So you can use that to great effect. Just don't do it, particularly with young heifers, but also calving heifers can still be a problem.
Okay, and I think this might be our final question. Kayleen says that she lambs continually all year round with ultra whites. Their condition is amazing, but I'm keeping the ewe lambs in the mob. Do you see a problem with ewes lambing, when they have their older lamb still in the paddock with them?
I think I know who Kayleen is, and not necessarily. Probably the biggest challenge of that will be, in an ideal world, we don't want maidens lambing in the same paddock as mature ewes. There will be a higher propensity of the mature ewes to try and poach lambs off maidens. So in an ideal world, we would keep maidens lambing separately wherever we can, and same for joining. This is an off-topic thing, but at joining, ideally we join maidens separately to mature ewes. Mature ewes know exactly what they're doing and will tend to hang around the ram, whereas maidens walk around the paddock oblivious to what's going on. So it requires the rams to go and find those maidens, and if they're in a mixed mob, the rams won't necessarily find the maidens because he's too busy with a bunch of mature ewes hanging around him. So there are a couple of the downsides of running those mixed groups, but outside of that, I can't really see too many issues.
Okay, thank you. We've had a few more questions come in. Ian would like to know, where is the uplift for breeders for lamb survival in practice, i.e. humans have a one-to-one contact?
Sorry, I'm not following that one.
Me neither. Ian, if you could please elaborate a little bit, that would be great. Meanwhile, John says it's interesting that birth weight is so important, but we all know environment is only part of the equation, yet genetics and ASBVs have not been mentioned. Isn't this just as relevant?
Absolutely it is, and the only reason it hasn't been that from that point of view, so we're looking at what we can manage at the point of lambing in terms of this, but if I could have another hour of your time, then I would spend a lot of time talking about ASBVs. And a big portion of what we do with our clients is to make sure that we are getting birth weight right from a genetic point of view. It's from an overweight in particular point of view, as in high birth weight issue, it's a significant issue across the industry, particularly in terminal size. So that does need to be included in the discussion. It's just a matter of how many topics we try and cover at once. So apologies that we didn't include that, but it is absolutely a topic for another day.
We could talk all evening for that bit. Carl would like to know, what is the ideal time to lamb in spring to match lambing when most feed is on offer?
Good question. My answer is about 2 weeks before your feed traditionally starts to grow. So as in from a spring flush point of view. So for us here, if I was to question most of our clients across Victoria, put a date on when your feed starts to grow coming out of winter, most of them will tell me the first week of August, about the 7th of August, for instance. So for me, we go 2 weeks before that is when we start, which lands us on the 23rd of July, if I have to throw a date at you. But that's obviously different for different locations and different rainfall zones. So often what happens though, if we go north of the Divide in Victoria, for instance, that date doesn't change. All that happens is the shoulders of the season tend to come in, so the season is shorter it doesn't necessarily change that point in time because our pastures shut down over winter not because of rain, but because of soil temperature. So it's actually quite similar for most locations. Clearly, there's a trade-off in everything we do. So the later we lamb, the harder it is to grow lambs out. The earlier we lamb, the less lambs you are likely to produce. So it's about trying to find that nice midpoint.
Talking about midpoints, Rick would like to know, how do you strike a good balance between too much feeding leading to too big a lambs and not enough feeding leading to preg-toxemia, especially in good seasons like the one we're experiencing currently?
That's walking the tightrope, and it is a real challenge because we know that if we end up with too much condition on ewes, we've got a much higher risk of sore feet and foot abscess, which can lead to hypercalcemia and preg-tox because she doesn't cover the ground, she doesn't consume enough feed, not enough energy, not enough calcium going through her body. So we are always walking a tightrope in trying to get that right. The best thing you can do is to be measuring pastures. If you've done lifetime ewe management, go back to your folder, look at how much energy she's likely to be consuming from the pasture, calculate what you're providing in terms of feed, and actually just sit down and go through the numbers in that critical period. Particularly the last 6 weeks of pregnancy, we are walking a tightrope. So it requires your effort to actually try and make sure you're getting it right. It's always an estimate, no matter how good we are at predicting feed on offer and doing those calculations. It's still always an estimate. We're still walking that tightrope, but at least if we've got some numbers around it, you can be more confident that we're getting it right.
All right, and Rick would also like to know if there's a period before lambing where feed should be limited.
I would say in twins and triplets, no. It's only in singles where it's not to, it's never to hold the ewes back too much, but it's just to make sure that she's not receiving excess feed that's going to go into extra birth weight in those lambs. Otherwise, it's generally trying to keep those ewes travelling and hit our condition score targets. So in an ideal world, I would like to have every single twin and triplet lambing down in that sort of 3.3 to 3.7 condition score range. If I could fit them all into 3.3 to 3.5, that'd be great. Almost impossible to do. And so we're always going to have some outliers below and above. It's just trying to get that right. Whereas our single bearing ewes, I just want to try and make sure they're at 3. And just so nothing excessive, just where we want them.
Okay, thank you. Laura would like to know if you have any recommendations on boxing mobs, either at the tail end of lambing or after marking.
Yes, so it's something that we underestimate in terms of the stress that's created every time we split or box a mob. So it's actually, if in a lot of the trial work that's been done, if they're measuring cortisol production, which is a stress hormone, mixing and splitting mobs actually has quite an effect on animals. So we do need to be careful about how much of that we're doing and how we're going about it. In an ideal world, we do it as quietly and carefully as we can so they drift together in terms of boxing mobs together. So that's with hot wires, that's really simple. You just go through and pull all your hot wires down, let that mob join back up together again. You'll often go back and find that they're still sitting in the 3 mobs or 4 mobs across the paddock, and even though the hot wires are gone. But I certainly see that from a practicality point of view, you can't bring every single individual mob in for lamb marking. As good as it would be to get the data on every single one of those little mobs that's sitting around, the practicalities of it just don't work in most cases. So putting them together over time, letting them drift together rather than just forcing things. Anything done in a rush in sheep is generally a bad idea. So drifting mobs together is a good way to do it. So from a practicality point of view, I'd be drifting mobs together before lamb marking. There's enough chaos going on at the time after lamb marking with lambs trying to find ewes without having just thrown an extra couple of hundred ewes into the mix as well. So my preference is you do it before, not after.
Yeah, sort of stagger the stress a bit over them.
Yep.
Yep. Robin would like to know, what is your opinion of lambing composite ewes on grazing wheat with turnip and radish included at sowing?
Wheat throws some challenges at us at any time, just simply because it tends to be, it is low in calcium, low in magnesium, high in potassium. So from a calcium management point of view, it's probably one of our highest risk options in terms of hypercalcemia in ewes. We saw an example recently of a client had wheat sown through some lucerne. He dropped some ewes into that paddock just on their way to their lambing paddocks. They're only in there for a couple of days. Unfortunately, the ewes didn't eat any lucerne. They only ate wheat, and he ran into some hypocalcemia issues. So wheat is always a bit of a concern. When it comes to cereals, our safest option from the calcium point of view, our safest option is oats, then barley, and wheat is our sort of most dangerous option. So theoretically, on paper, having turnips and other things in there should mean that they've got access to multiple feed types. The risk is that they don't eat those other feed types at the time and they just concentrate on the wheat, and then you end up with a hypocalcemia issue. I'd prefer oats or barley if you had that as an option, but at the end of the day, sometimes we have to take the energy over the calcium risk. If we're in a tight season and we've got no other feed options, then you take that, but you make sure you've got plenty of licks out available to them. Equal parts of lime, magnesium oxide and salt generally will help. But yeah, it's a band-aid. It's not a great answer.
Okay, Neil would like to know, what about corn as a feed?
I'll be honest, I don't know a hell of a lot about corn. So I'd probably be a bit reluctant to comment on it. I haven't had any experience with it.
That's okay.
Sorry, I assume if he's talking about a green feed, or if he's talking about it as a grain, if he's talking about it as a grain, it can be a very cost-effective option. We've seen corn at 15 ME, low protein but very good energy, and actually can be quite a good feed option in late pregnancy. But if he's talking about it as a green feed, I've had no real experience with it.
Okay, thank you. Lou would like to know if you've got any clever ideas about creating privacy in paddocks that is designed for fodder cropping.
Not really. I would say mob size is the number one thing. Anything you can do to make them use a paddock better. Occasionally we'll have a paddock where sheep spread out and they use it perfectly and they all stick to their own little areas, and we don't need to split mobs. But the reality is our use of electric fencing is to create privacy wherever we can. So if you want to make better use of paddocks, my simple answer for you is get used to using hot wires, because it's our simplest way of getting sheep to have their own bit of privacy. And just one I should share is one of the simplest ways I've found to wind up those temporary hot wires is you go to Bunnings and you buy the old style hose reels, the wire type ones. You cut the handle off so that you can put your drill on it, and you use your drill to wind up the hot wires. It's much faster than any of the other hand reel options.
That sounds brilliant. I think this might be our final question for the evening. James says, do you have a maximum ASBV for birth weight for composites in southern New South Wales, please? 0.3, 0.4 or 0.5?
I'm going to do a little bit of fence sitting here and say it depends on what your ewe base is and where we think you're at to begin with. So I'd be reluctant just to throw a ballpark figure. At the end of the day, if I can generalise across terminals and maternals, because they're the only ones that we've got recorded birth weights on, my general rule of thumb is to look and try and get it to sit around the 50th percentile. So if you get a percentile table and you have a look at where birth weight is for that breed or that database, so whether it's terminal or maternal, generally I try and sit around the 50th percentile. And that just means that we're not giving up too much, because if you go chasing really extreme low birth weights, you'll generally give up something else. And most often we're not chasing, we don't need extreme low. We just want moderate birth weights. So it's just avoiding those big ones. And we've seen before where we've had a client having trouble, it can sometimes just be one ram in a team that's causing the problem. So even just go through the process, go back through your ram team and look up their ASBVs today, not what you bought them at, because some of them will shift a little bit. And remember that one ram joining 70 ewes, which is generally the sort of percentages they're going out at, means that he's providing for you 2 lambs to pull every day through your 35-day lambing. So one ram can create what feels like a pretty big headache in terms of having to pull lambs.
Righto, thank you very much. I think that is all of our questions, and we've had plenty of them. So thank you very much, everyone. That's been brilliant. Some excellent discussions. Yeah, so thanks everyone for tuning in tonight. Please take time to fill out the survey at the end as you exit. And if you would like to re-listen to any of our questions or any parts that you may have missed, this webinar is recorded on the MLA website. Thank you very much and good evening.